Morning, everyone. It's time for us to get started. Appreciate you being here. We're in Acts chapter 28 this morning. Before we get started, let's go to God in a word of prayer.
Almighty God, our Father, we thank you, Lord, for the opportunity to be together to study your word. We pray, Heavenly Father, to help us to understand what you have taught this day. We pray, Heavenly Father, the wisdom that we gain from your word this day we carry for the rest of our lives, and daily we pray, Lord, that we'll learn more of your will for us. We're thankful for the brethren here at this time. We pray for those who are sick and unable to be here. We pray for those who are mourning over the loss of loved ones. We pray, Heavenly Father, to help us to encourage and help one another through the time of trouble. Thank you for all things. Pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Okay, Acts chapter 28. There's some lesson sheets in the back. If you didn't get one, feel free to help yourself or pick one up on the way out. And this is the Isle at Malta and Paul's final journey to Rome. Let's take a minute to read verses 1 to 10. Now, when they had escaped, they then found out the island was called Malta. And the natives showed us unusual kindness, for they kindled a fire and made us all welcome because of the rain that was falling and because of the cold. But when Paul gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened on his hands. So when the natives saw the creature hanging from his hand, they said to one another, "No doubt this man is a murderer, whom, though he has escaped the sea, yet justice does not allow to live." But he shook off the creature into the fire and suffered no harm. However, they were expecting that he would swell up suddenly and fall down dead. But after they had looked for a long time and saw no harm come to him, they changed their minds and said that he was a god. In that region there was an estate of the leading citizen of the island, whose name was Publius, who received us and entertained us courteously for 3 days. And it happened that the father of Publius lay sick of a fever and dysentery. Paul went in to him and prayed, and he laid his hands on him and healed him. So when this was done, the rest of those on the island who had diseases also came and were healed. They also honored us in many ways, and when we departed, they provided such things as were necessary. So the inhabitants of this island, they were shipwrecked, of course, and we studied about this last Sunday, and all the inhabitants show them kindness, and Luke describes it as unusual kindness. They kindled a fire, made them welcome, and I'm not sure whether the because of the rain that was falling and because of the cold refers to they kindled a fire or showed us unusual kindness. I guess both. But why do you think Luke would call this unusual kindness? Would it be unusual today if people were in distress, it was raining and cold, for a neighborhood to come out and help them? Would that be unusual? I think it'd be unusual if people didn't come out and help. I mean, you look at natural tragedies today, and I mean, people just, they're looking for an opportunity. So why do you think they would call this unusual? Well, evidently it wasn't usual in that time. We talk today about how bad things are. But, there are also some good things that we can point to. And that's something that struck me as I was reading this, studying it, that, this wouldn't be unusual today. And I think that's a good thing. Well, of course, they kindled a fire, and Paul's not just going to sit around and, warm himself at the fire. He's helping to get some firewood, and he picks up a a bundle of sticks, and there happens to be a snake in the sticks, and when he holds it over the fire, the snake comes out. Now, fire must have been pretty hot, because usually when it's cold, it takes snakes a little while to, get active, because they're cold-blooded. So this must have been a pretty hot fire. At least he was close enough to the fire that snake came zinging out and latched onto his hand. Now, one of the things that strikes me unusual here, when the natives saw the creature hanging from his hand, if a snake got a hold of my hand, no one would see it, because I'd get it off of there so fast. But evidently, I think it's just indicating here, not just that it was hanging from his hand, as if, Paul's just standing there looking at it hanging from his hand. It's not just him hanging, but rather the fact that he's snake bit. And so they're thinking along the same lines that most people thought of that day. And some people even think today, and that is, if something bad happens to you, what's the cause behind it? That's
you did something wrong.
That you did something wrong. You did something bad, and say, well, he escaped the shipwreck, and that's a remarkable thing. It seems to me that this implies that they are a little bit astonished that every single person from the shipwreck was saved. But still, the thinking of the day, and what did the disciples ask Jesus, the apostles asked Jesus when they saw the man who was born blind? What did they ask him? You remember? Who sinned? Who sinned? Now, the Jews had the book of Job. And the book of Job answers that question once and for all. Why did Job suffer? Because of Satan. Ultimately, it wasn't because of any particular sin on his part. And so suffering comes about as a result of Satan and as a result of sin. And so, this was the common thinking of the day, that this man who has the snake hanging from his hand must have done something bad. But of course, then he doesn't die, doesn't even begin to swell up. There's this nutcase, I call him a nutcase. He works for the government down there, but the Okefenokee State Park in South Georgia. Okefenokee. And they call him the rattlesnake man. And, he just hunts rattlesnakes, and he keeps them as pets and things like this. And he's been bit I don't know how many times. And they, he's been to the hospital, and they showed pictures. He just swells up like a balloon. And you think, if you've been bit once, you wouldn't go out and mess with him anymore. But evidently he hasn't learned that lesson. But anyway, that swelling begins. We're not told what kind of snake it is, but the swelling seems to begin pretty quickly. So he doesn't swell up and die. So they think, well, he must be special. He's not an evil man. He's a good man, even a God. So I'm not sure why there's not a lot written about him, about Paul correcting them, because on other occasions when he and Barnabas were praised as gods, that I forget where that is. I want to say it's 12 or 13, but anyway, I'm not going to dilly-dally on that too long, but they went to great extents to show that they were not gods. There may have been a language barrier here. I'm not sure. Paul was pretty well versed in languages. Anyway, it seems perhaps at least there's something more important they want to deal with, and that is Publius and his father, the healing of his father-in-law. And once this healing of his father, and once this takes place, then others came and he healed them. And then in verse 10 he just goes down to when they depart. And I don't know what to read into this. It seems to me that this is a perfect opportunity for Paul to do what? To preach. And it doesn't say that he didn't preach. It just doesn't say that he did. And I think it's reasonable to infer that he did preach, because if Paul had an opportunity to preach, what did he do? He preached. And so it seems to me that he probably preached, but we don't really have any record of conversions here or anything like that. And the only explanation, I read a lot why there might not be an explanation here, and I think the most reasonable thing is that they're on their way to Rome, and that's the key thing that Luke is focusing on right here. And so this really isn't about Paul's missionary journeys and preaching the gospel, but it's getting him to Rome, and then he goes back to preaching the gospel. As far as Paul being bitten by the snake, if you look at Mark 16, verse 17, this is a verse right after the Great Commission. It says, "These signs will follow those who believe. In my name they will cast out demons. They'll speak with new tongues." I think it's the next verse. He talks about them being bitten with snakes, by serpents. Luke 10, however, says, "Behold, I give you authority to trample on serpents and scorpions and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall by any means hurt you." Now, these were given these signs were given by the apostles. As a matter of fact, in Mark 16, it says as much. In verse 18, it says, "They'll take up serpents, and if they drink anything deadly, it will by no means hurt them. They will lay hands on the sick, and they will recover." Now, if you look at verse 20, they went out and preached everywhere, the Lord working with them and confirming the word in the accompanying signs. Now, in verse 17, he says, "These signs will follow." And then he says, the purpose of the signs there in verse 20 is confirming the word with those signs, which the Lord was working through them. So it's not they themselves, but rather the Lord working through them. Not so much around here, but even still in parts of Kentucky and maybe even parts of West Virginia, you have the snake handlers. And I heard a Baptist preacher, his family would go around and sing at different churches, and on their, they were kind of a traveling revival type thing. And so they went to this church and up in the hills of Kentucky, and they're singing and all, and then they bring out the snakes. And that Baptist preacher said to that Pentecostal, he says, "Where's the back door?" He said, "We don't have one." He said, "Where do you want one?" So I don't know if that's a true story or not, but it's, I was watching a documentary once that, this Pentecostal preacher, where they did the snake handling, they would, they'd handle snakes. And he had been bitten, I don't know how many times, and had sort of developed a little bit of an immunity where it didn't kill him right away. But in here again, they were showing pictures of him in the hospital, and his arm would swell up so bad that it would actually split. His skin would split well, that's hardly a description of, I would hardly say that it wouldn't harm them. It may not have killed them, but it certainly harmed them. Then they take these old mason jars and they'd fill it up all the way to about this much to the top with water, and then they'd put something that denatured alcohol. They'd put some denatured alcohol in it, which is poisonous. And then they'd drink it. Well, they didn't get sick right away, but by the end of that day, after drinking that, they were, throwing up and having to go to the emergency room and all these things. So, these were for the apostles, and they were for the confirmation of the word. And once that word has been confirmed, do you need to confirm it again? See, if you sell me a car, and we're doing the paperwork, and someone notarizes that, do I have to get a new notary every time I present that title to someone? No, it's been confirmed once. And so it doesn't need to be confirmed again. And so once this word was confirmed, it doesn't need to be confirmed again. Questions, comments, observations on verses 1 to 10. Verse 11 to 16, then they're going to leave Malta, and there's an Alexandrian ship that had wintered there on the island. So after 3 months, we sailed in an Alexandrian ship whose figurehead was the twin brothers which had wintered at the island. Landing at Syracuse, we stayed 3 days. From there, we circled around, reached Rhegium. After 1 day, the south wind blew, and the next day we came to Puteoli, where we found brethren and were invited to stay with them 7 days, and so we went toward Rome. And from there, when the brethren heard about us, they came to meet us as far as Appi, the Appi Forum and 3 Inns. When Paul saw them, he thanked God and took courage. Now we came to Rome. The centurion delivered the prisoners to the captain of the guard, but Paul was permitted to dwell by himself with a soldier who guarded him. Verse 11, these twin brothers, I think I have it on your outline here, are Castor and Pollux, who are the mythological god Zeus. Supposedly he had a tryst with Leda, and then she had twin sons, Castor and Pollux, according to the myth. And so these are this is the figurehead on the ship. And here again, this is another ship from Alexandria bound for Rome, most likely loaded with wheat. They get to Puteoli, and there they are permitted to stay 7 days with brethren. So I'm not sure why they delay 7 days, whether it's to rest or what, but it seems to me that this centurion is showing very unusual kindness, and he's unusually permissive toward Paul. Evidently there's a great deal of trust there, and rightly so, because to whom do they owe their lives? Apostle Paul. And seems to me he hasn't forgot that. So they're on there. It's a 170-mile overland trip to Rome from where they have landed. So they have to make that trip. And some of the brethren from Rome, once they hear that Paul has landed, and no doubt someone from Puteoli, where they had stayed 7 days, perhaps sent word to the Christians at Rome, and so they're anxious to see him. And I think this is what gives Paul great comfort. Paul's never been to Rome, or at least he's never seen the brethren, the church at Rome. Perhaps he had been there when he was a younger man, we don't know. But he has no doubt maybe some trepidation, certainly about the trial. The Lord has given him assurances, but Paul is still human. And you have the activities of these last months, being shipwrecked, and all of those days, 2 weeks without food stays with you a long time. It takes a while to recover from all of that. And they were treated well on the Isle of Malta, but he still may be, many of them perhaps suffering some of the results, some of the effects of that. Maybe that's why they stayed for 7 days. We're not sure. But one of the things that helps perk him up and gives him great encouragement is the brethren from Rome travel overland and meet them. I think they travel about 40 miles. So they're well over halfway on their journey to Rome. But they travel to find Paul. They're anxious to see him. And so this answers the question that Paul may have in his mind, and that is, well, how are they going to receive me at Rome? He had written them a letter from Corinth, the epistle to the Romans, but we just really don't have a record of how much correspondence he's had with them. So he gets to Rome, and he's permitted to dwell by himself in a rented home. We'll see in verse 30, and the soldier is going to keep him under guard at all times. He's always going to be in chains. Questions, comments, observations on 11 to 16. So he gets to Rome, and 3 days later he calls the leaders of the Jews together. So they came together. He said to the men and brethren, though I have done nothing against the people or the custom of our fathers, yet I was delivered as a prisoner from Jerusalem into the hands of the Romans, who, when they had examined me, wanted to let me go because there was no cause for putting me to death. So he establishes here, and Luke makes it clear that Paul is what? Innocent. That's right. He's innocent. And so he wants to establish that with them right away. Because the Jews in Rome, they're a little bit different from the Jews in Judea. They have a little different attitude toward the Roman government. And they're not as hostile toward the Roman government as would be the Jews in Judea. So if a Jew is brought as a prisoner to Rome, they might look askance at that and think, you know, what did this man do? Whereas in Judea, if a Jew was a prisoner of the Romans, well, he's a hero, or he is a martyr, or something like that, perhaps. So he wants to tell them right away, he is innocent. When the Jews spoke against us, verse 19, I was compelled to appeal to Caesar, not that I had anything of which to accuse my nation. So why is it that Paul is even there if he's innocent? Because that's the first thing I'm going to ask. You know, if I'm a reasonable thinking person and this man's a prisoner and he says, I did nothing wrong, what's my next question? Well, why are you in chains? Why are you here? Why did they go all this trouble to bring you here if you're not innocent? He says, well, they wanted to let me go back in Caesarea, but the Jews spoke against it. They didn't want me to be let go. And so he gives us here the reason why he appealed to Caesar, just as he stated earlier. This is a little more compact reason, but he says it's basically to protect myself. I was going to be let go, but the Jews spoke against it. Of course, we know that Festus wanted to send him back to Jerusalem. Paul says, no, I appeal to Caesar. And so that answers their question. Why are you here? I'm here because I appealed to Caesar, because I was being treated unfairly. Verse 20, for this reason, therefore, I've called you to see you and speak with you, because for the hope of Israel, I am bound with this chain. And he said that many, many times. Go back to chapter 23 and verse 6. This is when he's before the Sanhedrin. But when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, Men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee, concerning the hope and resurrection of the dead, I am being judged. Of course, this just lit them all up, and there was all kind of an uproar. Look at chapter 24 and verse 10. Then Paul, after the governor had nodded to him to speak, answered, Inasmuch as I know that you have been for many years a judge of this nation, I do more cheerfully answer for myself, because, let's see, let me skip around here. Verse 15, I have hope in God, which they themselves also accept, that there will be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and of the unjust. Now to go to chapter 25 and verse 18. When the accuser stood up, they brought no accusation against him of such things, I suppose, but some had questions against him about their own religion and about certain Jesus who had died, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. And then in chapter 26, beginning verse 22, therefore, having obtained help from God, to this day I stand witnessing both small and great, saying no other things than those which the prophets and Moses said would come, that Christ would suffer, that he would be the first to rise from the dead, and would proclaim light to the Jewish people and to the Gentiles. And so when Paul says, I speak of the hope that our fathers had, all he's talking about is everything in the Old Testament which pointed to whom? Christ. You can sum up the whole Bible with this word, Christ. The Old Testament, Christ is coming. The Gospels, Christ is here. Acts to Revelation, Christ is coming again. That's what the whole Bible's about. And so Paul said, that's all I'm talking about. Everything that is in the Bible that they had at that time, which was the Old Testament, it's all pointing to this one event. That Christ would come, that he would die, that he'd rise again, and that he would give us the same hope. We have the hope to do as he did, to die and to rise again. And that hope is in him. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 17, if any man be in Christ, what is he? A new creature, a new creature. Old things are passed away, behold, all things become new. And so there is the spiritual resurrection in baptism. There is the literal resurrection at the end of time. So this is the only thing that Paul is preaching, just what the Bible says. I had this person used to come up to me, I could probably count on it once every month or two. And this person would come up to me at the end of services and say, where do you get all of those sermons? I just hold up my Bible and say, I'm not smart enough to come up with this stuff on my own. It's just in there. And that's all Paul was doing. He says, it's in there. That's where the hope is. Well, they say, we don't know anything about you. Paul called them together, and this is the first time they've, met him or seen him. Now, they have heard of Christianity, verse 22. It's spoken against everywhere. Christianity spoken against everywhere. I have a lectureship book in my library called The Sect Everywhere Spoken Against. And it's taken from this verse. So they all came together on an appointed day. He persuaded them, verse 23, concerning Jesus, from both the law of Moses and the prophets, from morning till evening. I don't want to hear anyone complaining about the length of my sermons anymore. Oh, some were persuaded and some were not. And Paul, he confirmed the prophecy concerning them from Isaiah. Go to this people and say, hearing you will hear and shall not understand, seeing you will see and not perceive. For the hearts of this people have grown dull, their ears are hard of hearing, their eyes they have closed, lest they should see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn, and I should heal, so that I should heal them. And so this is the same situation in Rome that he's met everywhere else. Some are going to believe, some will not, but there's not a legitimate reason for their unbelief. Because Paul doesn't, number one, Paul has the signs, and it doesn't talk about any signs here. But the word has been confirmed. There are witnesses, no doubt, that could testify to that, to these Jews. He has the Old Testament scriptures, which affirm what he says, but some still disbelieve. So what's the only reason? If you prove something to someone and they still don't believe it, if you give them evidence and they still don't believe it, whose fault is it that they don't believe? It's their own. What's that? Yes, their own. It's their heart that's hard. It's their ears that are stuffed so they can't hear. Their eyes, they have closed. It's not that they're blind, they have closed their eyes. So that's on them. What's the old saying? You can bring a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. So, you know, that's the way it is with the gospel, Patty. They don't have to change. There's that. They don't want to be responsible. And they don't want to, this is just my personal opinion. In some cases, they don't want to pass judgment on their loved ones who have died before them in error.
Ezekiel 33 verse 3 refers to that very situation. Watching sees the enemy coming and sounds the alarm toward the people. To sum it up, if they respond, then it's okay.
Yeah.
And if they don't respond, let the people is going to get.
Yeah.
If he doesn't sound the alarm, let the people know.
And he's very specific. He's very specific about that. He says, you know, when I say unto the wicked, thou shalt surely die, and thou speakest not to warn the wicked from his wicked way, that wicked man will die in his sins. He says, but his blood is on your hands. But if you warn him, the same wicked man shall die in his sins, but you have delivered your soul. And so that's our response. Our responsibility is to teach, to baptize, and to teach. Matthew 28, 19 to 20. And Paul planted, what Apollos watered, but who gave the increase? God gave the increase. We're seed sowers. I've got some stuff growing out there in the garden, but I didn't make anything grow. I put the seed in the ground, put a little bit of fertilizer down there, and in this case, God does the watering. I watered it one time, then I remembered, hey, we're on city water. We got to pay for that, and I put the hose away. But I didn't make that grow. God made it grow. God put the life in that little seed. He put the life in the soil. All any farmer does really is just put the seed in the ground. So anyway, Paul does not have a lot of success there with the Jews. This is a case, you know, every time Paul went into a city, he'd go to the synagogue to preach to the Jews. And we'll see this in Romans chapter 1. The gospel is God's power of salvation to the Jew first and also to the Greek. And so first, in every city, he'd go to the synagogue. But not much success there, generally speaking. In verses 30 and 31, well, he tells the Jews, he says, you know, I'll preach to the Gentiles and they'll hear it. Verses 30 and 31, he dwelled 2 whole years in his own rented house, but all this time he's chained to a soldier, and received all who came to him, preaching the kingdom of God and teaching the things which concern the Lord Jesus Christ with all confidence, no one forbidding him. A number of things here. These 2 whole years is the time when he wrote at least some of the prison epistles. There's an ongoing debate with some of the prison epistles, whether they were written from his prison in Caesarea, Felix, and when he was waiting to be judged by Felix and Festus. He was in prison there for 2 years, and he's in prison in Rome for 2 years. We know at least 2 were written from, well, at least 1 was written from Rome, and that's Philippians, because he talks about here in Philippians 4:22, all the saints greet you, but especially those who are of Caesar's household. Now, these most likely were servants from Caesar's household, maybe even slaves. But Paul's not wasting time here. Now, you know, if you're enduring all of this, you might think to say, well, look, I'm in prison. I'm chained to this soldier. I'm under house arrest here, not a literal prison, at least not this time in Rome. I deserve a break. God needs to cut me some slack. Paul didn't look at it that way. He said, wouldn't you like... You think listening to me is bad. Think about that Roman soldier chained to Paul. I bet they could quote that in their sleep. I don't know how many obeyed the gospel. I imagine some of them did. But being chained, and he's just preaching all day, every day. You know, there's only so many crossword puzzles you can do. In Philemon also, Paul writes to Philemon regarding Onesimus. He says, I'm sending him back. You therefore receive him, that is my own heart, whom I wish to keep with me, that on your behalf he might minister me in my chains for the gospel. He goes on to say, but I've sent him back to you because I wouldn't do anything without asking you first. So Onesimus is a runaway slave and basically deserves death under Roman law. But Paul tells Onesimus, look, you've done wrong. You need to go back to Philemon. You need to be straighten things out with him, and then hopefully Philemon will send Onesimus back to Paul. So he told Philemon, he says, you receive Onesimus in the same way you would receive me. And so he's doing some reconciliation here. But he taught, he says, the verses surrounding that, he says, I have begotten him in my chains. So Onesimus is one of the ones who obeyed the gospel after hearing Paul's preaching when he's in prison. So, you know, can we be a minister, can we minister for the Lord in whatever circumstance we're in? It's hard for me to think of a circumstance where I couldn't do something for the Lord, even if it's prayer, if that was all that I could do. Questions, comments, observations? And there is this. It's very likely, and I think I wouldn't hesitate to call it a fact. But because it doesn't state it explicitly, I'll refrain from doing that. But Roman law stated that any plaintiff had 2 years to bring his complaint against the defendant. And the fact that Paul spent 2 full years in Rome indicates to me that the Jews from Jerusalem never came to Rome to make their case against the Apostle Paul. And that seemed reasonable to me. How successful had they been with Felix? Not at all. How about with Festus? Not at all. And so, even these 40 men that took a vow, they're probably starved to death by now. It seems to me they never came, and therefore it's a necessary inference then that Paul was released from prison. So he's been in prison now for 4 years. And Paul talks about, we'll see in the book of Romans, that he wanted to go to Rome initially so that they could help him financially to go to Spain. And it seems to me reasonable to conclude that he did indeed go to Spain. But according to 2 Timothy, he ends up back in Rome under Nero, while not because the Jews are persecuting him, but rather the Romans are persecuting Christians at the instigation of Nero, the burning of Rome. Questions, comments, observations over anything in the book of Acts, or this chapter in particular?
I was thinking possibly, they really didn't say much about Paul preaching on Malta. They received Paul of God. So it might be, Jesus said, don't cast the pearls before the swine. Maybe Paul realized that these people they never even heard, maybe even heard of the God, or Jesus. And he knew that it would be pointless to convince them. They would have told him that he wasn't even God, because he healed, so, wow, there's gotta be a God. So, I'll probably just, not that they were terrible people, but he just knew that they would not be receptive. And it's something entirely that they would not be able to understand. And I mean, that's just a thought, and there's no scripture proves that.
Yeah.
It's a thought that I had.
So you think that Paul, it may be that he was not going to cast his pearls before swine, that they would not have believed.
Why? Because they weren't,
Right,
they were evil people.
right.
People that were, their culture, their beliefs, they may not even know about Christianity or about meeting one God, because they had God.
Right.
They didn't even know, at first, I don't think they knew what island it was, that they landed on, so then they found out that it was Malta, so.
I think there are two things that maybe go against that thought. And that is, Paul wrote to Titus, he talked about the Cretans. And he said, they're all gluttons and evil beasts. But he still wanted the gospel to be preached to them on the island of Crete. And so that might go against that thought. And the other is that if that was the case, I think it unlikely that Paul would have continued to heal the others who were brought to him. But it's interesting. It is interesting why there's nothing mentioned there about it. So I mean that may be it.
Very last verse in the book of John that talks about Jesus. Everything he did, written down, the world.
Right. The things that The things that we have trouble with is not what's written, it's what not written. Okay, next week we get in. Yeah, maybe so. Just out of compassion, you say? Yeah, maybe so. That's an interesting thought. Okay, next week we get into Romans.